There we go. All right, great. So yes, we have started the recording. So today, again, we're just going to be review. Let me zoom in. Review, prompts, state, use effect. So again, starting off with props, as Sean sort of broadly described, are things that you can transfer between components, and then a state is something related to rendering. So, but before we continue, I'm gonna ask someone who hasn't spoken yet. So let's see. Um, Danielle, would you mind defining in your own words or ideas what a component in React is?
Um, a component would be like a piece of a page that it maintains the code so you don't have to rewrite it over and over again.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a reusable piece of a website. So would anyone like to give an example of like what a component could be?
It could range from anything like a button to like an H2 tag to anything.
Okay. Then I mean this is true. This is true. Um, but let's think a little bit more broadly. Are components generally things on the level of individual tags or individual elements? Or are components usually a collection of elements?
It can
Go ahead.
it can be both.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. What I will say is generally components are sort of like larger reusable pieces of a website. So instead of being like a single, you generally will not see a component for like a button, like slash button. You won't see it for something, you may see it for something like that if it's going to be reused a bunch. But in general, you might see a component for something that's like a form that has multiple input fields and a submit button. So it's something that, again, sort of consists of multiple lower level component or multiple lower level elements. Generally multiple HTML elements. Another example of this that is reused. Another is the Google search bar. That, for our purposes, if you want to think of a really simplistic explanation of it, the Google search bar has two like sub elements, right? It has the input and it has the search button. Now that Google search bar is put on the Google homepage, and it's also put when you hit enter and it displays the results page, right? So it's used on homepage plus results page. I guess pages technically. So that's another example of a simple in terms of the number of things it includes, but super critical component. Now, you can also have components that are not reusable, that but you want them to be components because it's easier than putting 15 giant chunks of code on one page. So another example of a component could be, let's say you want to have like a table of products on your web page. Like if you're designing a shopping page, you're going to design, like a something that shows 9 products at once, 3 by 3. Now, that table itself could be like a flex box or a grid, which is its own component. But the products inside that are displayed, think of like, Amazon or eBay. Each of those little like cells that has like the product name, the product image, a link to the product, the price, that is also most likely going to be a component as well. So, yeah, components they're the building blocks of your website. So let's now get back to that sort of conversation we were just having about props and state. So if components are sort of the building blocks of a website, why do we, well, let's start with state, actually. It's probably easier to go from states to props than vice versa. So why do we need state? Like what do states do for us as developers?
Um, I would say states allow us to control, monitor, um, data that we are rendering, like Sean had mentioned earlier. Um, it it allows us to maneuver that page for a specific cases, events, right? All in, things like that.
Yeah, that's pretty true. Um, Another way to think about state is a state is sort of the way a component stores data. So there's a distinction between like a variable and a state, right? To make it simple. A variable is something that when you re-render the page and you reload the component, that variable is just going to go back to what it was before. But ideally, the state should maintain its value as things as you successively render your page, right? So the another major benefit of states are immutable. I'm going to put a bunch of asterisks there, while variables can be changed.
Umar,
Yes,
I have a question.
go for it.
So I realize that the state, we say that it can't be changed, but I mean, that it won't be changed if the page re-renders, which is due to it being a const. But I wonder if you put if you just name a variable with const and you don't use the use effect, will it still hold that same value since it's a constant?
Yes. So const, by definition, from what I recall, basically means that once you set the value, it doesn't get changed.
Okay, so when we do a refresh of that page, whatever value it had before, it should still have it. Then, right?
No. So
Then, if that's the case, then use effect must be. Hmm. Then I wonder then why we would need use effect then.
so we'll get to use effects shortly. So I would hang on to that.
Okay.
Um, but to get back to the issue of state, which is related, but we'll go through props really briefly after, and then we'll
State.
jump to use effects.
Okay. I
Um,
was the state, not the use effect. Sorry.
oh, use state. Okay,
Yeah.
all good. So actually, well, no, let me add one or two things, and then we'll start talking about use state. So, and to reference what state is, it's the way that the component stores data, and importantly, so states are consts, so they can't be changed easily. They can still be changed, which we will get to. But the most important thing about a state versus a normal variable is when a state is changed, I'm going to call it parent component, is re-rendered. So what's an example of this? Does anyone have one from any code that you've written or that we've looked at before?
Well, even just the one that automatically comes up when you create a new one, the count that's on the right page.
Exactly. So the counter is a perfect example of state. So it is set to 0 as a constant, but when you click that button, well, let me ask someone to talk through it. Actually, Kim, since you did volunteer the example, what happens when you click the counter button on a page in terms of like state and use state and component rendering?
So if it's count, when you're setting it, you've got count, then you've got set count. And it's that clear. Do you want me to explain what I mean by that? I know you know, but do you want me to explain that or not?
Yes, please.
All right, so when you're setting a state, you do it by putting inside square brackets the name of the state you want to use, like count. And then it's just kind of convention that you do set state with a capital S. And then you make that equal to use state. And then in parentheses, you put the whatever you want to initialize it to. So then if somewhere in your code you use set state and it changes state, then the page is re-rendered. And if you have any use effects, they're also rendered, right?
Yes, that's perfect. So yeah, as you said, the only way that you can change a state is to, let me switch off my laptop's notifications. The only way that you can change a state in React is if you run the set state function, which you define when you set that the state is a state and not a random variable, which you do, as you said, using the square bracket notation and use state. So in order to change the state, you have to run set state, and again, you can name it whatever you want to do. You can call it, for that counter example, you'd probably define something like count, set count is going to be like use state 0, or something like that. Then, let's, pseudo coding here, like on button click, set count to count plus 1. Do not say count plus equals 1. Line 23 will not work because that's not the way that we modify states. The only way to modify a state and its value is to run the setter function or the set state function that's for it. So, and basically, right, it'll say once the state is changed, then once the state is changed, the page or the component will re-render and display the new count. So again, that's a very general overview of states, and thank you, Kim and Mike, for your questions and explanations. There's one other piece of state that I want to touch on before we get to prompts. Let's say that I have my counter component, but I also have a navigation bar component. Can my nav bar component access count and set count?
No, components are, I mean, states are just used by the component is the only, right? That I don't know how to word that.
Yes, so states belong to their parent component. They cannot be accessed by other components. However, I think this goes to something Sean was referencing earlier, but Sean, since you already volunteered, I'm going to call on someone else for the first round. This may or may not be related to props, which is down below. So would somebody, actually, here, let me go back through the participants list. Daryl, based on what we talked about for states and how states cannot be accessed by other components directly, can you talk about how props are kind of linked to that?
Sure. Yeah, with props, you can kind of pass in, I guess, the parent component state, and that through the props, it allows the child component to I guess, manipulate that state at the child component level, which will also update at the parent level.
Okay, so the first part of that was correct. So that it does allow you to send the parent component state to a child component. However, this does not allow the child to modify the parent state. So it only sends over a a static copy, if you will. I think that's a better way to work. Copy of parent component state. So like for example, if you sent count as a prop to, let's say that, I was hitting my counter button and I hit it like 6 times. So the count is now 6. If I send count as a prop over to some other component, the other component does not receive count as a state. It just receives count equals 6. So it does not allow you to modify the parent state. So because of that, props are immutable. Their value cannot be changed. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes, but I guess if you pass in like a setter method as a prop,
So you can't pass in the setter method as a prop.
I thought we were able to.
At least unless I'm thinking of something else. Do you have an example that you want to like talk that you could talk through or share?
Uh, I'd have to find it.
Oh, wait, no, sorry. Okay, I think I get what you're saying. So what you're suggesting is like defining. So, okay, disregard. Yeah, I see what you're saying now. So you can pass in a setter method as a prop, which so like okay, let's go back to the button example. If I have like that counter button, but I also create some other component. So let's say we have like new component, that's our, I don't know, nav bar or something. So you can pass the set count function to navbar as a prop, and you can run the set count function via navbar. However, you cannot directly edit the set count function in navbar. Like I can't change the definition of that setter function.
Right.
It's sort of the same thing. Like, let's say that instead of saying I want to give, because by running the set count function via navbar, indirectly you're giving navbar the ability to just run that function. What you can't do is, for example, you can pass in count into navbar as a prop. But if you do that, you cannot change the value of the count prop within navbar. So like unless you pass in set count, and then that sort of goes into what you were talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is that clear to everyone else as well? Or are there questions about that? Okay, I'm not seeing too many confused looks, which is good. So again, the main benefit or the main thing of props is, again, they're immutable. Their value cannot be changed inside of their child components, right? It's sort of like, let's see, what's a good example of this? Oh, yeah. If you guys have like downloaded PDFs off the internet or you get like sent a PDF and then Adobe tells you you can't edit the PDF, like this PDF has been locked for editing, that's kind of like what happens with a prompt. You're seeing the same PDF as the person who sent it to you, but the person who sent it to you can edit it, which is kind of like set state. You do not have that ability on your end unless they send you a way to edit it, which is kind of like what Daryl was talking about sending a setter method. Okay, so that was, again, a brief overview of state and props. So now let's talk a little bit, and we'll leave props down at the bottom, so I'm going to delete all this empty space. Let's talk a little bit about something that Mike was referring to, which was a use effect. So again, kind of a nebulous concept, but an important. Would someone briefly like to tell me in their own words what a use effect is and why it's useful or why it's used? Full stop.
What's your question?
So why do we use effects instead of, say, event handlers?
I know that I remember you can have many different use effect cases.
Aren't they
Like,
for things outside of React?
Can you explicate a little bit more on that, Tisdale?
Not really. I just remember that it had something to do with like if you needed to bring in or use stuff like outside of React.
Yep. No, that's completely correct. So you can use that to link with I'll just write it exactly what you said. Outside of React, examples of this are things like bringing in APIs, editing the DOM, and things like that. That's one primary use case of use effect. So thank you for mentioning that. But let's see. I'm trying to think about how else we can tackle this. And Mike, since you are already started down this answer, I'll give you the first stab at it. Back in JavaScript, like when we were just coding stuff in native JavaScript, if we had to do something based on like a button click or in form input, how would we write the JavaScript code to do that?
The HTML DOM. Um, the
Okay.
DOM, the DOM document was one to monitor events that took place.
Bingo. Yes, that is the keyword that you referenced there was events. So the old way of doing things, here, I'll write this up here. We'll do it outside of use effect. No, we'll do it inside. Old way of doing things was event handlers, which would listen for a specific event to happen. What are examples of events? Again, sort of like I mentioned, form submission, a button click, input in a text box, things like that. However, instead, and then if that event handler went off, then something would happen. However, React doesn't really use events in the same way. The reason that we use effects is because now we want to look at changes in state in order to trigger a re-render of a component. So the old way, again, we had event handlers, which would look for a specific triggering thing to then do stuff based on that. The new ways, again, changes in state, which is basically a change in value of a variable, is going to trigger a re-render. A change in state is not an event necessarily. Most of the time, though, that is not an event, which is why we have to use effect instead of um, instead of event handlers. And again, the other part of it is exactly what Tisdale said about use effect being used to link with things outside of React. So, for example, if we think about, let's think about an API, right? If you are sending a request to an API, you have to do that with the async await framework that we talked about back in JavaScript, because you need to wait for your API data to get returned to you. Now, we could define a state of the component as being API. We could define a state. Let's call it, API data. Here, let's first say const API data, and then set API data. It's going to be like some used state, and then we can just make it like blank. And then after that, let me just write this down here. It's like an example. Oh, I muted myself. Let me change that. Then, eventually you could run, async await code to get your API data. And then you can set your API data to be, whatever data the API returns. Now, let's say that after our API returns our thing, we want to display something on our web page. If we were only using event handlers, a button has not been clicked. The user has not interacted with the page in any way. So when the API returns its data, you're not going to see an event go off. So you don't have a reason with an event handler to refresh the page. However, your state is going to be updated. When your state gets updated, you can then use a use effect to tell React, hey, something fundamental just changed. I want you to re-render my component with whatever thing just changed in mind. That's the fundamental usage of use effects for us. Another thing to keep in mind is that use effects are run after a page has finished rendering, not before, but they can be used to trigger re-renders. And there's 3 broad categories of the number of times that you can re-render something, that you can have a use effect run. Does anyone remember what those are, broadly speaking? Or what the dependencies of a use effect mean?
Oh, you're talking about if you in that dependency section, you can run every render or only on the first render or only on the first render and whenever a variable is changed.
Exactly. Yep. So on the first render,
Which you would leave a blank for that.
right. Yes. So I should have clarified the question a little bit. So, which was, when can you run a use effect? And this is all based on the dependency. So the format of a use effect, sort of like we talked about for state, the format is going to be, you're going to say use effect, then you're going to say, define some function or some, code that you want to run, and then your dependency, which is how often you want to run. If you want to run it every render, your dependency is going to be blank. If you only want to run it on the first render, does anyone, or sorry, if you leave it blank, let me say blank. That's what I meant to do. On the first render, it's going to be empty brackets. And then if you want to do it whenever a state has changed, you just say what the state is inside those brackets. But yeah, so again, the main sort of benefit of using useEffect is, especially for our purposes, when you're getting data from that API. Because again, you could, let's say that, I think one of the examples we did was for the joke, for the dad joke API last week. Imagine if you have a really slow internet connection and you're sending a ping to this dad joke API and you're waiting for data to come back. You don't want the page to re-render, the moment that someone hits the generate new dad joke button, which is how you do it with an event. Because if they hit that button, it's going to start the process of going to the API and pulling the data and bringing it back. That them hitting the button does not guarantee that the data is already there. If you re-render at that time, it's not going to work. However, if you create a state for the joke, you wait for the joke to come to you through your API. You set the state when it gets received, and then you make a use effect based on that. The page will only re-render when it gets the data from the external source, which is exactly what Tisdale mentioned. So let's see if there's anything else I want to bring up for use effect. Yeah, honestly, I think that's about it. So just in conclusion, I mean, the main things we've talked about React-wise so far are components, which are kind of like the Lego blocks of, or the Lego blocks of any website that you make with React. And think of these sort of like your Python classes. They're generally, you can have components that consist of nested components. You can have components all the way down, but ideally you want your components to be higher level rather than, individual HTML elements. Components have states, which are the ways that components can persistently store data. States are a special type of variable. They're constants that cannot be changed unless you run a set state function in order to modify them. When a state gets changed, its parent component will get re-rendered. And again, states belong to their parent components. So you cannot directly access a state through a child component unless you pass it in as a prop. And you can change the value of that state, as Daryl mentioned, by passing in the set state function, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can also pass in a copy of that state as a prop. Sort of like, again, you can pass in a copy of count if that's your state that cannot get changed, but it can still be accessed. Lastly, again, states are super important because states also are used to drive use effects, which is the primary way in React that you re-render your components and update them to show new stuff. And use effects are entirely based on changes in a state. If your state changes, then you can re-render the page and among other things, and trigger functions using a use effect. Okay, we are just about at the 1 hour mark for a lecture. So that was really most of what I wanted to talk about today. Let me go and pull up the curriculum page real quick, just to see if there was anything else there that we could go over. So yeah, props are passed down from parent to child. They're immutable and read-only. States are mutable. And again, this is sort of the format of how we initialize them. And effects do things caused by rendering and changes in state. And here is, actually, you know what? Let's just take a few minutes and do a quick code analysis. So, all right, well, I was going to ask if this was a state or a prop, but pretty much tells you that already. So we'll forget that for now. Well, here we have, can someone tell me what welcome message, what type of thing welcome message is? Is it a function? Is it a state? Is it a component?
Is it a component?
It is a component. Thank you. And it's taking in some props that, again, it's not changing the props, but it is displaying certain attributes of those props on the page. Thank you, Danielle. All right, so now we also have this app function. So is app a component or a state or something else as well?
And the
Should be
main,
a component, right?
It is a component, yes. So whenever you see app used in React, like as in capital A, lowercase p on its own, and if it has an export default down at the bottom, that is going to be your app component. That's where everything in React, that's sort of like your main body, if you will, that everything gets chugged into. So yes, this is like the component that is sort of built off of other components, like welcome message. So we see here that it's got a couple of states. Right? Have like goal given and daily goal. Got a little use effect in here. And let's see. Well, when is the use effect going to get run? It's based on the code.
whenever goal given or daily goal changes.
Okay, yep, that is true. So let's take it one step further. When and how do the goal given or daily goal, when and how do those change?
When the button is clicked and it sets goal given.
Yep, so goal given will change when the button's clicked. So let's walk through this framework of what happens sort of step by step. You click the button, goal given gets changed to from false to true. All right, so now our use effect is going to get triggered because goal given is changed. So it's going to fetch data. It's going to then run this fetch data function. What does fetch data do? That is our async await that we were talking about. And this is exactly the use case of use effects and state that Tisdale was referring to earlier. So you're going to await for some data to come in. You're going to turn it into your API, your JSON, and then you're going to then set the state daily goal using, again, we cannot say daily goal equals because it's a state. So we're going to set our daily goal to be, this activity thing. So once we have now set our daily goal, we can then re-render our page. Once we render the page, we can then add in, well, we can pass it daily goal, which is our state here. Note that again, because we are rendering or we are returning some JSX within our parent component, we can return the state directly, right, which is just in curly brackets. However, when we're passing it along as a prompt, like user info, we're bringing in that in. Well, actually, user info here is, well, user info is not actually a state. So it's just a normal thing that's getting passed on. But if if my info was a state, then we would have to represent it differently when we're passing it in as a prompt. So maybe that's not such a good example. We can modify that for next time. But again, when you click the button, it's going to change one of your states. The change in one of your states is going to trigger the fetch data function, which is then going to change another one of your states. And then that change is going to be reflected in the daily goal portion of the website. And then you can repeat that ad nauseum for however many times you click the button. So this is sort of a good example of how state and use effect kind of work hand in hand, and prompts as well, I suppose. Are there any questions about the concepts we talked about today or how they all sort of work together before we get to the group exercise?
I guess I'm not entirely clear where props are getting used in that.
So it's, well, actually, I guess they kind of are. So here we are sort of sending props over, well, we are sending props over, as it says right here, because props are an input to welcome message. And we're sending over this constant called myInfo, which is, because it's a constant, you can't change its value. So you're sending over this dictionary of like a name and age as a prop. We're just basically just getting input into our other component. Does that help?
I'm not sure. What, can you back it up again for a second?
Sure. So again, here all we've done is we've defined myInfo as a variable. That's a constant. So you can't change the value of myInfo. But down here, when we are referencing the welcome message component, we're sending it a prop that we're calling user info that contains this stuff inside it.
Okay, I see. I think it's confusing because usually we were putting all the components in different places. So here we're passing props in one file, and it's a little bit confusing, but now
It's because props is not destructured. The way we've been doing is destructuring it to simplify it. But this is like saying this is what your object is going to be called.
Yeah. So it's saying like all the props you take in are going to now be inside of this one mega structure props that then has the sub props within it. But the way we've done it before, as you said, Sean, is we would, instead of say bringing in props like that, we would just be putting user info in there directly.
In brackets, of course.
Yes, in brackets.
okay, thanks.
But yeah, I think the other, this is all in one file, which in general, I do not recommend. As you correctly noted, you want to keep one file for one component. But I think they just did that to keep everything together and slightly better organized. Any other questions?